Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture Albion Never Dies. Today I'm looking at Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express with no spoilers. No spoilers whatsoever, so if you haven't seen it, haven't read it, don't worry. I'm delving as ever into the British aspects of what is a very well-known story, but a story whose twist in the tale is a big part of its enjoyment, so I won't spoil it. From the dust jacket, with a small cut to avoid a spoiler, the famous Orient Express, thundering along on its 3 days' journey across Europe, came to a sudden stop in the night. Snowdrifts blocked the line at a desolate spot somewhere in the Balkans. Everything was deathly quiet. Decidedly, I suffer from the nerves, murmured Hercule Poirot, and fell asleep again. He awoke to find himself very much wanted, for in the night murder had been committed. The untrodden snow around the train proved that the murderer was still on board. Poirot investigates. He lies back and thinks, with his little grey cells. Murder on the Orient Express must rank as one of the most ingenious stories ever devised. The solution is brilliant, one can but admire the amazing resource of Agatha Christie. So that's from the inside of the dust jacket, like I say, with a little cut to avoid any spoilers. I'll talk about Agatha Christie, I'll talk about the adaptations, some British aspects of it. But first I shall have the privilege, as it is my podcast, I shall have the privilege of talking about my own experience with it. It's something that I've heard about. Murder on the Orient Express is a well-known Agatha Christie title, but I first read it back in 2018. At this point, I had not heard much about anything about the contents, but I was staying at the Pera Palace Hotel in Istanbul. This is the place where Agatha Christie wrote Murder on the Orient Express, and the hotel has a great deal of history in itself. As I said, never read it, didn't know the ending, and I always thought I was very, very lucky just to enjoy learning about it just by reading it in the place where it was written. It's a classic English murder mystery, and that's what I'm delving into. As I say, I'll talk about the original novel quite a bit. That's for me the absolute high bar when talking about it, is the groundwork. I know sometimes when I talk about 007, I have to bear in mind that whilst I take Ian Fleming's original novels as the bar, the movie version very much has a life of its own. I don't think that's so true of Agatha Christie's work. By the way, Fleming is relevant in this because the Pera Palace Hotel is also where Ian Fleming stayed in Istanbul when Fleming did his research for From Russia with Love. He was following in Agatha Christie's footsteps. The hotel James Bond stays in From Russia with Love is written as the kind of opposite of the Pera Palace. It's named the Crystal Palace, and all the Pera's good points are the Crystal's bad points. It's a good humorous twist, and interesting that the hotel really celebrates their Christie connection much more than the Fleming connection. There is a picture of him in the bar, but Murder on the Orient Express is on sale in English and in Turkish with a fun little display with the book and a model train in one of the public hallways. So I spent an amazing afternoon in the Pera Palace's afternoon lounge enjoying Turkish coffee, Turkish delight, and reading this exceptional novel for the very first time. Perfect environment to do so, soak up that luxurious atmosphere there, which is also depicted in the novel. And back in 2018, I was enjoying the well-known Turkish pianist Ali Bozkurt, who has since passed away. I was lucky enough to stay there a few more times, on one occasion actually singing From Russia with Love, with Ali Bozkurt accompanying. By the way, this podcast is not sponsored by the Pera Palace. I've been approached by a few companies, but I haven't taken to their products or their approach. I host my own podcast with no interference. Since 2018, I have watched 3 of the most well-known movie adaptations, and I've even travelled on the train used by one of them, a genuine Orient Express carriage, with my friend Daniel Gaster, who you may know from YouTube, The Field Office, and Instagram, Daniel Gaster. And I've also watched the Lucy Worsley documentary on Agatha Christie, which has spoilers for a couple of the books. The 3 versions of Murder on the Orient Express that I watched was the 1974 movie, That's the one with Sean Connery in a very, very, very minor role. He was hired first, and this helped convince a whole constellation of British stars to take part. Then there's a 2017 movie, the Kenneth Branagh version. This film has very few redeeming features in my view. It departs the furthest from the book with the least results, which is no disrespect to Kenneth Branagh himself, the man who's done more for William Shakespeare than William Shakespeare ever did. He's a great actor, a great director, but this just isn't a great film. And finally, I watched the 2010 TV movie starring David Suchet, which for me, is the definitive version. I think if you watch one version, watch this. And I might even, don't bother with the other versions, understanding that many people might be partial to the classic 1974 version. I suspect that's an element of nostalgia, but that's no bad thing. Nostalgia is perfectly allowed. All the versions have some little departures from the book. I think the 2010 TV movie has the smallest, and I think some of the small departures actually help the story a great deal. There are also some omissions, but I suspect that's mainly for runtime. Oddly, being a TV movie doesn't make it seem smaller than the others, and in fact, I think they have some really impressive results visually as well as dramatically. Yes, I have my favourite, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. First, who was Agatha Christie? For those who don't know, there's a great website, agathachristie.com, and that describes her as a writer, traveller, playwright, wife, mother, and surfer, with a great picture of her surfing, I believe on the south coast of the UK. Great picture to accompany their little biography. States she was born in Torquay, 1890. She became and remains the best-selling novelist of all time, best known for her 66 detective novels and 14 short story collections, as well as the world's longest-running play, The Mousetrap, still being performed. Her books have sold over 1 billion copies in the English language and 1 billion more in translation. If you really want to know lots about her, as I said, I do recommend the Lucy Worsley documentary. It has some spoilers of a couple of key books, so maybe read Murder on the Orient Express and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd first, or just don't worry about spoilers. It doesn't spoil all of them. She wrote 66, and they're all pretty good. In fact, I hadn't read that second one when I watched it. As I'm recording this in Yorkshire, I feel I have to make note of her Yorkshire connection. From this, I went to the oldswanhotel.co.uk website, which states, well, the connection, it sounds like the plot of one of her novels. A woman leaves home in the dead of night. Her car, later found abandoned on a rural hillside. There's no sign of a struggle, no goodbye note, and no explanation. For 11 days, the most famous crime writer in Britain simply vanished. The year was 1926. Agatha Christie, already a household name, had been rocked by a double blow: the recent death of her beloved mother and her husband Archie's confession that he was in love with another woman. On the 3rd of December, after fierce arguments, he left their Berkshire home to stay with his mistress, and that same night, Agatha quietly kissed her sleeping daughter good night, got into her Morris Crowley car, and drove off into the darkness. The car was later discovered near Newlands Corner in Surrey, perched awkwardly on a slope, its bonnet buried in a hedge. The engine was off, but the mystery had only just begun. No trace of the novelist was found, only a single clue remained, a letter left for her secretary, vaguely hinting that she was heading to Yorkshire. What followed was national hysteria. Thousands joined the search. Lakes were dredged, cliff tops were combed. Public outcry grew so loud that the Home Secretary demanded daily updates. Even fellow writers got involved. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, took one of Christie's gloves to a psychic in the hope of divine insight. Then, 11 days later, the mystery cracked wide open. A musician at the Swan Hydropathic Hotel in Harrogate, now known as the Old Swan, recognised a guest who had been staying quietly under the name Mrs. Teresa Neal. She had been enjoying dinner alone in the Wedgwood restaurant, walking the gardens, reading the papers. She seemed relaxed, entirely unbothered by the storm raging outside her bubble of calm. The name she used, Neal, was no coincidence. It was the name of her husband's mistress. Agatha never publicly spoke about what happened during those missing days. Doctors at the time suggested she was suffering from amnesia, possibly triggered by grief. stress, and betrayal. Others speculated she had staged the disappearance as a publicity stunt. Some believed she had been trying to punish her husband by making it look like he'd murdered her. We'll likely never know, but one thing is certain: the old swan became the last chapter in one of the strangest real-life mysteries the country had ever seen. To this day, you can dine in the same Wedgwood restaurant where Christie took her meals, walk the same corridor she paced, and sit in the lounge where one of the greatest literary minds of the 20th century quietly hid in plain sight. That's all from the website of another hotel that does not sponsor the podcast, although maybe they should. It does mean this hotel hosts the Crime Writing Festival most years, not always. They are sponsored. Theakston Old Peculiar, a local ale, sponsors this Crime Writing Festival, which really hammers home the connection of crime writing, Agatha Christie, and Yorkshire. So, having talked so much about Agatha Christie and Yorkshire and her disappearance, I feel I should move on to her great creation, Hercule Poirot. It is a very English series of stories that he appears in, but he, of course, is Belgium. He is a fictional Belgian detective created by Agatha Christie along with Miss Marple, and he is one of her longest-lived characters. He appears in 33 novels and 54 short stories, and has been portrayed on screen by actors such as Albert Finney, Peter Ustinov, Ian Holm, Tony Randall, Alfred Molina, David Suchet, Kenneth Branagh, and John Malkovich. The fact that he's Belgium is clearly the result of the book being written in 1916, although it was only published in 1920. Not only did his coming from a country occupied by Germany provide a very good reason why such a skilled detective would be out of work and available to solve mysteries at an English country house, but also, at the time of writing, it was considered patriotic to express sympathy with the Belgians, since the invasion of their country had constituted Britain's casus belli for entering World War I. I'd also suggest it was really important because as a Belgian, he was somewhat outside the English class system. So he can move up and down the social scale, he can move from town to country without being burdened by whatever qualities an English detective might have. In fact, it's quite difficult to draw any concrete conclusion about Poirot's family due to the fact that Poirot often supplies false or misleading information in the course of his mysteries. He was portrayed, additionally to the people I've named, he was portrayed by Orson Welles in the radio adaptation in 1939 of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and more recently, if we're sticking to audio versions, by Peter Dinklage for the Audible adaptations. My favourite, by far, and I'm not alone, is David Suchet, who portrayed him from the late 1980s until very, very recently, and he does my favourite, Murder on the Orient Express, which I think is Series 12, Episode 3. The runtime is 1 hour, 32 minutes, 51 seconds of that, I'm sure. And I'm going to talk about the flaws of the others, so I might as well talk about a flaw in this one. If there's one flaw, I think is the oddity. When they show Turkey in the opening, Malta doubles for Istanbul in a few scenes, and not entirely convincingly, to my mind, but then I do know Istanbul better than many. It also adds in the stoning of an adulterous woman in the streets of Istanbul, which isn't in the book or any other version, and does seem like a slightly odd thing to put there, to my mind, but it does have a few more religious elements which are touched on later, which the TV series increasingly had from around 2003. Now, I dislike that first element, the stoning of the woman. I thought it was strange, but I liked the consideration of Poirot's religious views, and I feel those fit the time and those fit his character. Unlike the others, I really enjoyed how this adaptation showed the effects of being snowed in and the increasing cold and how it's getting to the characters. They use really simple techniques in terms of filmmaking, but I think they were used much more effectively than the, in some cases, quite expensive movie versions. I just think they get a lot more bang for their buck, and I think it works dramatically better. So it's the best version of Poirot, to my mind, and every other cast member also shines. I haven't yet seen a bad episode of this ITV series. As for the 1970s versions, well, for Murder on the Orient Express, it's the Albert Finney version. In 1974, he played Poirot, and many consider that to be the definitive Poirot until David Suchet took up the role. The 1974 film is a very, very faithful adaptation of the novel. Again, apart from the opening in Istanbul, which is a bit weak, not done very well, and it looks kind of more like India than Istanbul. But again, a very, very successful film. Some have called it the most successful British film ever made at that time. It also received a stamp of approval from Agatha Christie herself, which I think is important. Finney is so far the only actor to receive an Academy Award nomination for playing Poirot, although he didn't win. Albert Finney was then replaced by Peter Ustinov in kind of successive films. Ustinov played Poirot a total of 6 times, starting with Death on the Nile, and then reprising the role in Evil Under the Sun. He didn't get the stamp of approval from the Christie family, but he seemed happy enough with his own performance from various interviews and commentaries. So Ustinov also played Poirot in 3 made-for-TV movies. I don't think there's a lot to shout about there, except the odd fact that David Suchet did appear in one of them as Inspector Japp, just before he played the famous detective himself. Ironically, it's reputed that David Suchet highlights this performance as Japp to be possibly the worst performance of his entire career. So the 70s version, I think, is decent. I think it is a bit plodding. If anything, it's a little too accurate to the book in places. Overall, it was nominated for 6 Academy Awards. Ingrid Bergman did get the Oscar Best Supporting Actress. And it's an amazing cast. Lauren Bacall, Ingrid Bergman, Sean Connery, John Gielgud, Vanessa Redgrave, and many, many others. And they're largely left to kind of do their own star turn, to act as they like. There were concerns in the making of it about the lack of snow in the weeks preceding the scheduled shooting of the snowbound train, and plans were made to truck in large quantities of snow at considerable expense. However, heavy snowfall the night before shooting made the extra snow unnecessary, which is just as well, as the snow-laden backup trucks had themselves become stuck in the snow. Every cast member who was approached eagerly accepted. The director, Lumet, went to Sean Connery first, stating that if you got the biggest star first, the rest will come along. He was right. Connery and Lumet had a personal connection. They'd worked on 3 prior films: The Hill, The Anderson Tapes, and The Offence. Finally, I have to talk about the Kenneth Branagh version, because if you Google Murder on the Orient Express, this is still the first one that comes up. 2017, my verdict, absolutely dreadful. I lost interest after the 3rd fist fight. There's no fist fights in the book, but there were many, many throughout this film. Everything from the script to the CGI to the costume design felt very, very off. It does have Dame Judi Dench, of course M, in the Bond films. There's Princess Dragomirov. A good performance, but not her best, and there's relatively little for her to do in this version. It's not the biggest role. It's a good performance considering all other actors out there, but it's not a great performance considering she is Judi Dench. And it's much the same for William Dafoe. I rarely enjoy him in most films, but he's just not great in this. Of course, he is great as the main villain in the 2004 video game James Bond 007 Everything or Nothing, playing the man who wants revenge on 007 for killing Max Zorin in A View to a Kill. That is indeed a better performance than what he gives in the 2017 movie, but then he has a lot more to work with. There is an Audible version that was also released, I think, 2017 to coincide with this film. That's probably a better use of your time. According to Amazon, sound effects were recorded on the Orient Express itself. Again, not impossible. I visited the real carriages at the Nene Valley Railway with Daniel Gaster. That location was also used in Octopussy, GoldenEye, and for the Audible version, the narrator is Art Malik, who of course was a Bond ally in The Living Daylights, starring Timothy Dalton. So again, my recommendation is the David Suchet version if you're going for that. If you're going for the book, well, let's talk about the book. According to the Agatha Christie wiki, it was first serialised in the American newspaper The Saturday Evening Post from September 1933. In book form, it was first published in the UK by the Collins Crime Club on the 1st of January 1934, and in the USA by Dodd, Mead and Company, probably around February. The same year, under the title of Murder in the Calais Coach. In the US, the title of Murder on the Train was used to avoid confusion with the 1932 Graham Greene novel Istanbul Train, which had been published in the United States as Orient Express. So always a bit of confusion with Agatha Christie and her book titles, because quite a few of them have different titles in the UK and the US, which can mess with Google searches. For the story itself, I keep describing it as very, very British, but the three investigators for this one: Hercule Poirot, he's the detective, and he's Belgium. Monsieur Mabouk, the director, and is a fellow countryman of Hercule, so he's also Belgium, and Dr. Constantine, who is Greek. Of course, he's the doctor. Again, because they're they're outside our class system. They're also not French or German, so they're not one of our European rivals. They're not American, so we're avoiding that unique dynamic. Belgium, most Brits at the time fairly subscribed to the idea of gallant little Belgium. That's a set phrase, gallant little Belgium, unfairly treated during the First World War, but performed its part admirably. And a Greek, well, a country the UK had supported during its independence campaigns and beyond, I would say in a very similar way to how the United States today supports Israel. I think that's a fairly good, if simplistic, comparison. Don't have time to go into that more than anything else, but I think those nationalities were chosen very, very deliberately. As for the rest of the cast, what are their nationalities? We have 5 Americans: Samuel Ratchet, Hector McQueen, Mrs. Hubbard, Antonio Foscarelli, and Cyrus Bethman Hardman. Some of these roles have changed in some of the adaptations, but we have 5 Americans: Ratchet, an unsavoury-looking rich American who employs Mr. McQueen, a tall, handsome young American, as his secretary and translator. Cyrus Hardman is a private investigator from New York City, so an interesting role as well. An interesting selection of Americans there, again from different socioeconomic backgrounds. There are then a group of characters we could broadly class as Europeans. Again, there's some identity shifts throughout, which I won't spoil. But from the start, we have the idea of Pierre Michael, who is the French conductor of the train, Princess Natalia Dragomirov, an imperious elderly Russian noblewoman and grand dame, again well played by Judi Dench, I guess, Fraulein Schmidt, who's of course German, Count Rudolf Andrényi, a tall, dark Hungarian diplomat with English manner and English clothing, his wife, and Greta Olsson, a middle-aged blonde Swedish missionary. Poor dear, she's a Swede, I think is one of the lines. So here we have 6 Europeans. So we have 5 Americans, 6 Europeans. What is the British contingent? Just 3. Edward Masterman, Ratchet's British valet, so Ratchet has 2 servants with him, 1 American, 1 British. Mary Hermione Debenham, yes, another Hermione in British culture. She's a tall, dark, young British woman working as a governess in Baghdad. And Colonel Arbuthnot, a tall British Army officer returning from India, in fact part of the British Indian Army, which I think the distinction is made clear in the Sean Connery version. Colonel Arbuthnot is an interesting character, and I also think done very, very well as a slightly younger character in the TV version. But we only have 3 British characters. I have to talk about the Anglo-American relationship because it is talked about in the novel. The novel is set up into 3 sections. Part 1 is the setup, Part 2 various perspectives on events, and Part 3 where Poirot's little grey cells kick into action. So in Part 2, Chapter 2, the American Secretary McQueen talks about Colonel Arbuthnot and the events of the night in question. Colonel Arbuthnot was still standing in the corridor. His compartment was already made up for the night, so I suggested he should come along to mine. I ordered a couple of drinks and we got right down to it, discussed world politics and the government of India and our own troubles with the financial situation and Wall Street crisis. I don't as a rule cotton to Britishers, they're stiff-necked lot, but I liked this one. And then later on in Chapter 8 of Part 2, Colonel Arbuthnot is asked about McQueen. Colonel Arbuthnot said, "I never saw him before this journey. We fell into casual conversation yesterday and both became interested. I don't, as a rule, like Americans, haven't any use for 'em." Poirot smiled, remembering McQueen's strictures on Britishers. but I liked this young fellow. He got hold of some tomfool, idiotic ideas about the situation in India. That's the worst of Americans. They're so sentimental and idealistic. Well, he was interested in what I had to tell him. I've had nearly 30 years' experience of the country, and I was interested in what he had to tell me about the financial situation in America. Then we got down to world politics in general. I was quite surprised to look at my watch and find it was 1:45. I quite like that. The British perspective on America and the American perspective on the Britishers, of course written by a British author. I mentioned that we non-British characters heavily outnumber the British characters, and each film version I've watched, each adaptation, I haven't really noticed this. I've always thought of it as very, very British. A similar question came up when I'm looking at the Britishness of James Bond films. So when I talked to Calvin Dyson on my podcast, he was talking about the most British Bond films as being the ones most set in the UK. David Zaritsky was talking about kind of themes. So this, if it has kind of British themes, I would say first and foremost, the class dynamics. So Ratchet with his two manservants, there are references to other houses and backstories of good houses and bad masters and good, the other way around as well. They being used in contrast to each other. We also have a really interesting scene on the difference between class and just having cash, which I'll get to a little bit later, and also the importance of being a decent employer and a decent officer. Hard to discuss without spoilers, but as a general point, the world of maids and manservants existed in the USA, I'd say especially on the East Coast, quite as much as in the UK. They weren't common necessarily, but they existed in both. But they sit really, really differently in pop culture. It's beyond common in the UK to see dramas, perhaps some would say made for export, where it's the lord and lady of a manor and it's all their servants and it's all the goings on in the house. That's really, really common in our drama. It's not common at all in American drama to show that. And equally, the story goes into aspects of duty and obligation. Again, I'm drawing what David Zaritsky said in the episode recently where he appeared, and he was talking about the importance of duty in the Bond films, and I think you can find it throughout English literature, as well as it going both ways, that the master has obligations towards his servant and vice versa. There's also, of course, just the importance of certain characters. Just because there's more non-British characters doesn't mean that they have more kind of pages or importance in the plot devoted to them. And finally, you could say it's just an English crime story because it's written by an English woman, very, very much in the English tradition of crime writing. She acknowledged the importance of Arthur Conan Doyle and other English crime writers and other British crime writers and beyond. And America had a very different crime writing tradition by this point, which had been noted by her American critics. I'll go into that money is not enough aspect by reading out one more section from the book, which I think really, really highlights that and has some interesting points to it. It's Ratchet, the rich American, talking to Mr. Poirot. He's trying to recruit him for a job. Ratchet says, "My life has been threatened, Mr. Poirot. Now I'm a man who can take pretty good care of himself." From the pocket of his coat, his hand brought a small automatic into sight for a moment. He continued grimly, "I don't think I'm the kind of man to be caught napping. But as I look at it, I might as well make assurance doubly sure. I fancy you're the man for my money, Mr. Poirot, and remember, big money." Poirot looked at him thoughtfully for some minutes. His face was completely expressionless. The other could have no clue as to what thoughts were passing in that mind. "I regret, monsieur," he said, "at length I cannot oblige you." The other looked at him shrewdly. "Name your figure, then," he said. Poirot shook his head. "You do not understand, monsieur. I have been very, very fortunate in my profession. I've made enough money to satisfy both my needs and my caprices. I take now only such cases as interest me." "You've got a pretty good nerve," said Ratchet. "Will $20,000 tempt you?" "It will not. If you're holding out for more, you won't get it. I know what a thing's worth to me." "I also, Monsieur Ratchet." "What's wrong with my proposition?" Poirot rose. "If you'll forgive me for being so personal." "I do not like your face, Monsieur Ratchet," he said, and with that he left the restaurant car. Now, in some adaptations, Ratchet even has wads and wads of cash on him, and he tries to leave it on the counter or forcibly thrust it into the Belgium's hands or pockets. And I'm not suggesting that Ratchet, with his money obsession, would be a hero in an American story, quite the contrary. But I think the money on the table would not be refused in quite such a way, and a hero who's wealthy enough to refuse work is unusual in most, how can I put it, all American stories that I see. Ones that rarely want to plaster the stars and stripes on their stories would probably, to my mind, have an underdog, somebody who maybe takes half now, half on arrival, somebody who desperately needs that money so he can go and see his daughter or do one more thing one last time. But Poirot's not like that. He's not an underdog, everyman character. He is wealthy enough, aristocratic enough in some ways, just as Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes is the second son of a very wealthy family, doesn't need to work, can happily have his flat in London and potter about doing whatever he finds most interesting. There is a classic British hero motivated by his sense of, well, for the most part, what's interesting enough to get him off drugs for the early stories, but later on kind of changed to be what's right and what's wrong. James Bond is motivated by his duty, I'd say, in the best films, and I think the worst ones are one that's tried to make it kind of too personal. Roger Moore's James Bond in The Man with the Golden Gun is just a man who loves his job and wants to get at Scaramanga because Scaramanga is threatening his position, which he enjoys, but he does say he does it for, Queen and country and all that. So I think having heroes motivated by a sense of right and wrong, a sense of duty and obligation, does make it a very, very British story, along with just the maids and manservants aspect to the story. Anyway, this is a thought that I've had relatively late in the making of the podcast, especially once I started kind of categorising where all these different people were from, because Agatha Christie is exceptionally good at that throughout all her stories. She'll draw people from different backgrounds, wealthy, poor, professional, and a range of others, normally from the UK, but in this case, the majority are not from the UK. So if you have any thoughts, do message me, Fleming Never Dies, on Instagram, or if you want to send an email, albionneverdies@gmail.com, or just go on my website, albionneverdies.com, and there's a contact me form there. Let me know what you think. I think this is a very, very British story, and I think the really good adaptations lean in to the Britishness, and the really poor ones don't. And there are a range of adaptations. But let me know what you think, because I'm always interested in your thoughts. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Thomas. Goodbye.